I felt ugly due of my Tourette syndrome, so I hid. The most radiant grins can occasionally conceal the most intense suffering. The millions of admirers who followed the amazing narrative of one young woman were the only ones who knew this. When Baylen Dupree from Baylen Out Loud finally revealed what was truly going on behind the cameras, fans were moved to tears by her tragic story. What began as an uplifting tale of life with Tourette syndrome evolved into something far more nuanced and sinister. Everything her audience believed they knew about Baylen would be altered by the secret she had been holding. It was a conflict that nearly took the life of the girl who made everyone laugh. Her narrative is going to leave you speechless. The girl who made everyone chuckle. Baylen Dupree was an average girl who faced a remarkable obstacle. But from the start, there was something odd about her. Baylen was coping with something far more significant that would influence every part of her life. While most children her age were preoccupied with schoolwork and making friends, she had Tourette syndrome, a disorder that caused her voice and body to act in ways she was unable to control. When your brain is constantly instructing your body to move or make noises, imagine attempting to sit quietly in class. Baylen had to live with that every day. However, she did something extraordinary rather of withdrawing as many others may have. She made the decision to let everyone into her world, not realizing that doing so would bring her both unfathomable fame and unfathomable suffering. What began as straightforward social media videos swiftly expanded into something far more significant than anyone could have imagined. Baylen's health wasn't the only reason people were observing her. She was intelligent, humorous, and very daring, which is why they were watching. Everyone laughed as she made jokes about her tics. However, her eyes always had a deeper quality that suggested a battle far more serious than anyone at the moment understood. Throughout these early years, her family was there for her at every turn. Together, they made videos, shared laughter, and demonstrated to the world that it was okay to be different. Baylen's genuine attitude drew people in with her contagious energy. Even when she was having a bad day, she had a knack of making everyone around her smile. As she created a community of people who felt less alone due to her openness. Her parents and fiancé Colin looked on with pride. However, viewers were unaware that beneath every happy face and humorous video, Baylen was engaged in a struggle that would ultimately bring her to her knees. Baylen Dupree's tragic journey was only getting started, and it would soon be impossible to ignore the suffering she was concealing. Everyone who believed they understood her tale would be shocked to learn the secret she was harboring. The girl who made everyone laugh was having a hard time finding her own grin. And as her notoriety increased, so did the pressure to live up to expectations, which would eventually be too much for any young person to bear on their own. When TLC approached her with an offer that looked too good to be true, everything changed for her. In order to give viewers an intimate glimpse of what it was truly like to live with Tourette syndrome, the network intended to produce a show on Baylen's life. It was Baylen Out Loud. All of a sudden, she was more than just a social media celebrity. Millions of people watched her every action, every tic, and every moment of her existence as a television star. For the young woman who had always wished to change things, it initially appeared to be a dream come true. Baylen would at last have the opportunity to spread awareness of Tourette syndrome on a much larger scale than previously possible. She could demonstrate to the world that individuals with her illness were no different from everyone else. Like everyone else, they had dreams, hopes, concerns, and moments of humor. She had the opportunity to influence people's opinions and attitudes throughout the nation. Everywhere Baylen went, the cameras followed her, painting a personal picture of life with Tourette syndrome. They documented her happy moments when she felt comfortable face the world and her tics were under control. Her terrible days, when the tics were so horrible that she could hardly move or leave her room, were also captured on camera. However, the emotional toll that this continuous attention was putting on a young woman who was already going through more than anyone realized was not captured by the cameras. Baylen poured herself wholeheartedly into the show. She wanted to be the ideal representation of a person with Tourette syndrome because she was determined to be the best advocate she could be. She wanted to show other young people that they weren't alone and to encourage them if they were facing similar difficulties. But, in unexpected ways, the demand to constantly be on, to always be upbeat, and to always be instructive was getting to be too much. The tension that was brewing behind the scenes was visible to her parents and boyfriend. They saw as Baylen worked harder and harder to live up to the expectations of everyone, including the network and her admirers. She felt obligated to speak for a whole group of individuals with Tourette syndrome. And day by day, that duty was destroying her spirit, and no one could see where it was going or how bleak things would get. Baylen was beginning to break under pressure that no 22-year-old should have to bear alone, behind the scenes, away from the cameras and the bright lights. Viewers witnessed an inspirational young woman using humor and elegance to educate the world about her situation. They failed to notice that she was gradually losing herself while attempting to please everyone else, which paved the way for a catastrophe that would bring tears to the eyes of her supporters everywhere. The burden of perfection, every error, every difficult day, and every vulnerable moment was immortalized for millions of people to watch because it was broadcast on television. Baylen felt that she had to always be flawless, which is hard for anyone, much less someone who had a neurological disorder. Unlike other people her age, she was unable to simply have a typical bad day. Millions of people were observing, evaluating, and developing opinions about her every action while she fought. Her family and those closest to her began to worry about the pressure as it began to manifest. Baylen started attending to therapy 4 days a week, which meant she was working on her mental health practically every day. Despite this, she continued to tell everyone she was fine and smile for the cameras, even if she was on the inside. In a moment of terrible honesty, Baylen would later confess, "I was embarrassed of who I was." When supporters finally heard these words, it was like a punch to the stomach. In her heart, the girl who had taught children to embrace their individuality and be proud of their distinctions was embarrassed of herself. In reality, the strain and stress of continuous filming and public attention was making her Tourette syndrome worse. Contrary to what she had been going through a few years prior, the tics that viewers saw on Baylen Out Loud were really far better. She would further clarify, "It's 30 seconds of 4 years of my life," to assist others comprehend the truth of her predicament. In my opinion, that tiny portion doesn't even come close to capturing the calamity of feelings, bewilderment, and despair. When fans eventually realized the entire extent of what Baylen had been going through, this discovery brought them to tears. They understood that what they were watching on television was not Baylen's worst, but rather her greatest. How terrible had things truly been during her lowest points if she was now doing better? Everyone's perception of her entire journey will soon be altered by the heartbreaking response to that inquiry: the unfulfilled college aspiration. Baylen, like many young people her age, had aspirations that went well beyond social media fame and television cameras. She desired to leave the spotlight that had characterized her adolescence behind and attend college, where she could live her life as a typical student. She eagerly registered in classes, pleased at the prospect of, for the first time in her life, simply being another face in the crowd. For Baylen, college held a special meaning: freedom, normalcy, and the opportunity to find her true self outside her illness and fame. She envisioned making friends who knew her only as Baylen and not as the girl from Baylen Out Loud, strolling across school unnoticed and sitting in lecture rooms without cameras watching her. This felt like the perfect gift for someone who had spent the most of her early adult life in the spotlight. However, her other illnesses, which accompanied her Tourette syndrome, had quite different intentions. A lot of individuals are unaware that Tourette syndrome rarely manifests on its own. It frequently results in anxiety, depression, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, and other difficulties that can make day-to-day living extremely challenging, particularly in high-stress settings like college. In a moment that devastated everyone who heard it, Baylen disclosed, "I had to drop out of college because my other conditions got too bad." It was more than simply her twitches getting out of control during exam stress. This was about a young woman whose mental health was deteriorating to the point where she could no longer do the essential tasks of being a student. Even seemingly simple things like going to class, finishing homework, and connecting with classmates felt like too much work. Baylen's decision to drop out of school was heartbreaking because it meant losing yet more aspect of her typical young adult existence: freedom, independence, and the opportunity to forge an identity distinct from her health condition and public character were all symbolized by college. She felt more lost and alone than ever after that dream was destroyed by events beyond her control, as if another aspect of who she was being taken away. The tipping point. Every person eventually reaches their utmost limit in their struggle, when they are unable to bear the burden of what they have been bearing on their own. That moment for Baylen Dry was when she spoke words that no parent ever wants to hear from their child while staring at them with despair in her eyes. All who loved her would be haunted by those words. "I said, I have to go," after glancing at my parents," Baylen disclosed during a tearful panel discussion that rendered the audience utterly stunned. The atmosphere was filled with tension and heartache as a result of those few words. This has nothing to do with physically traveling or relocating away from home. This story was about a young woman who had run herself completely ragged and had no idea how to move on. For the first time, she said these heartbreaking words out, her voice breaking as she confessed, "I didn't want to be alive." The girl who had made millions of people feel less alone in their troubles by making others laugh and smile was drowning in anguish from which it seemed impossible to get away. Everyone who had been following her tale from the start was taken aback by the discovery. This person appeared to be strong, tough, and able to handle any challenge life threw at her. And she had been going through so much pain in quiet that it nearly killed her. It was sad to see the stark contrast between her public image and her inner suffering. When her parents saw how serious their daughter's problem was, they didn't even hesitate for a second. "They came and they got me," Baylen added, recounting how her family rushed to her aid in order to help her get through this potentially fatal circumstance. The pressure to be flawless, to be a beacon of hope for countless numbers of people, and to never be permitted to simply be human had driven Baylen to a point where she could see no way out of the harm that had already been done in so many ways. Those who had followed Baylen's journey from the start were shocked to learn that someone so vibrant, inspiring, and full of life had been going through such intense pain behind the scenes. They began re-examining old videos and pictures with fresh eyes, looking for clues they might have missed, and they began to wonder how they could have been so unaware of her suffering. In reality, Baylen had spent years learning how to remain strong when she was falling apart on the inside, how to make jokes when she felt like crying, and how to smile through the worst. Her ability to conceal her pain had become both a survival skill and a trap that kept her alone during her darkest moments, the struggle for her life. Baylen had to make a decision that would impact her entire future after she had reached her breaking point and was looking into the depths of despair. She could either give up and let the darkness win, or she could fight for her life with everything she had left in her. Fortunately, with the help of her family and professional support, she decided to fight. However, fighting doesn't always look like what people expect from inspirational stories or movies. It can also look like taking medication that makes you feel different from yourself, going to therapy 4 days a week, sitting in uncomfortable chairs, and talking about painful memories. Or it can look like removing yourself from the spotlight that initially caused the pain, even if that spotlight was your identity and career. It was no longer just about managing her Tourette syndrome, though that was still important, but about learning how to live with the crushing weight of being a public figure while dealing with severe mental health challenges that most people couldn't even imagine. Baylen started working with mental health professionals who understood the unique pressures she was facing as a public figure living with a neurological condition. They didn't care about the show, the fame, or what people might think of their decision to prioritize Baylen's health. They didn't worry about disappointing fans or losing opportunities. Her family came together in ways that demonstrated to the world what true unconditional love looks like in action. Slowly, Very slowly, Baylen started to find her way back from the darkness that had almost consumed her completely. The path wasn't straight or easy, and there were many setbacks along the way, but they cared about getting their sister, their daughter, the help she needed to survive and eventually thrive again. She discovered that it was acceptable to not be okay, a seemingly straightforward lesson that was revolutionary for someone who had spent so much time feeling pressured to be flawless, that seeking this visionary strength and self-awareness, and, above all, that her value as a person was not dependent on how well she could motivate others or how accurately she could portray her condition to the outside world. The battle for her life was quiet and showed in the day-to-day activities of choosing to continue even when everything seemed hopeless, taking medication even when it made her feel weird, and going to therapy sessions even when she didn't want to talk. It wasn't glamorous or camera-ready, and there weren't any dramatic breakthrough moments or triumphant speeches that could be turned into inspirational clips. And gradually, day by day, Baylen Dupree learned to live again. New beginnings. Recovery isn't a straight line with distinct milestones and predictable progress, and Baylen's path back to stability was paved with daily ups and downs that put her resolve to the test. Some days were better than others, with hope and clarity piercing the gloom. One of the most significant things Baylen learned during this challenging process was how to set boundaries, something she had never been taught or encouraged to do. Other days felt like steps backward when the weight of everything seemed too heavy to carry. But slowly, gradually, she started to rediscover parts of herself that had been buried under years of pressure and pain. Her entire sense of self had become entwined with being reachable and meeting the expectations of others, and she had felt obligated to share everything with her fans for years. She was now discovering that it was not only acceptable, but also essential to keep certain aspects of her life private and protected. When you've met one person with Tourette, you've only met one person with Tourette, she explained. She also started to understand her Tourette syndrome in a completely different way, apart from her role as an advocate and educator. This was not just education for her fans anymore. It was Baylen coming to terms with the fact that her experience didn't have to be flawless or representative of everyone else's journey. Having someone who loved her, not in spite of her struggles, but in spite of them. Someone who saw her as a complete person rather than an inspiration, made all the difference in her recovery. Her relationship with Colin grew stronger and deeper as they worked through these difficulties together as a team. He had witnessed her at her lowest point and had stayed, supporting her through the darkest moments without judgment or conditions. Baylen was learning coping mechanisms that truly worked for her particular situation and personal needs. And she was learning that healing was possible even when it felt completely impossible on the hardest days. What had once felt like a burden, something she had to do 4 times a week just to survive, became a lifeline that was actually helping her create something new. Baylen Dupree's tragic journey was gradually changing into something else entirely, turning into a tale of survival and reviving after almost losing everything that was important to her, including herself. However, the most significant lesson Baylen learned was that she didn't have to bear the burden of the world As Baylen started to heal, she also started to find her voice in a new way, realizing that her story of struggle and recovery might be even more significant than her initial message about living with Tourette syndrome. She was given permission to be flawed, to struggle, to have bad days without feeling like she was disappointing millions of people, and to find her voice once more. For the first time, Baylen opened up about her darkest moments during a panel discussion. The audience was moved to tears as she talked about how close she had come to giving up completely, but they were also inspired by her honesty and will to keep fighting. Baylen's willingness to be vulnerable about her mental health struggles sparked needed conversations. The response from her community was overwhelming, and people who had admired Baylen for her strength now admired her even more for her honesty, realizing that true strength wasn't about never falling down. Fans started sharing their own stories of depression and anxiety, thanking her for demonstrating to them that it was okay to not be okay. Baylen's revelation left fans in tears, but for a different reason than before. They were crying because they finally realized the full extent of what Baylen had been going through. Her tics, which had been much more severe just a few years earlier, had significantly improved through treatment and stress management. The tragic journey of Baylen Dupree from Baylen Out Loud had come full circle, but it wasn't the circle anyone had anticipated. Her family is still her strongest support system, and their love helped her get through the darkest times of her life. They were crying because she had survived, because she was still here, still fighting, and still inspiring people in a whole new way. Colin stays by her side, demonstrating that true love is about choosing to love someone whole rather than finding someone perfect. The girl who nearly didn't want to live has grown into a strong mental health advocate, demonstrating to others that it is possible to lead a meaningful life despite major obstacles. How do you feel about Baylen's bravery in sharing her most difficult times? Have you ever been moved by someone's candor about their hardships? Share your thoughts in the comments section below.